Welcome back to the Hub. We have a great topic this morning and very pleased to welcome Will Pomerantz, who is the head of space ventures for AeroVironment. His presentation is Doing More with Less, from human-powered flight across the English Channel to solar-powered flight to Mars. Please join me in welcoming Will.
Let's go. Good morning, everybody. Hi, it's wonderful to be back at SciTech after a couple years' absence. Wonderful to be here at the Hub. Thanks for joining us early in the morning and fighting through the crowds in the coffee line to get here. I'm really excited to talk to you about what we're going to talk about today because I started my career in aerospace industry as a planetary scientist studying Martian geology. And I didn't continue in that field for the main reason that back in those days, I thought that in that field, I would have been very, very lucky if in my career I got to work on 2 missions. And I always knew that I was a bad day away from 2 missions becoming 1 or 0 missions, right? Because some hardware didn't work, or because some politician changed their mind, or because some other wind of fate blew and reduced that to 0. I discovered I had a little bit of a passion for trying to make things more affordable and more easy to do, in the hopes that by doing so, other people who had those ideas, like exploring Mars and other worlds, wouldn't just get to do 2 in their career. Maybe they'd get to do 2 in their undergraduate career, and then 2 in their graduate career, and then so on and so forth throughout the years. My belief is that when you can do more with less, when you can make those opportunities much less expensive, they become much more frequent, which makes them open to many more people, many more institutions, many more ideas, good and bad, many more instruments, many different types of campaigns. And that's where a lot of my interest lies. I feel really lucky to have joined a team at AeroVironment that shares a lot of those beliefs. Even if they didn't start from the angle of Mars, they started from a very different angle with an idea like human-powered flight. So human-powered flight is an idea probably about as old as humanity. It's something that just about every culture on the planet has myths and legends about. It's something that almost as far back as we have records of humans doing anything approaching engineering, we have records of people trying, or at least pretending that they tried and telling people that they tried. You know, whether it's Da Vinci or whether it's Icarus or again, pick your legend from, pick your culture. People have wanted to do this for a long time. But unfortunately, we don't live on a planet that is terribly conducive to human-powered flight. Right? Between our gravity and the thickness of our atmosphere, we were not necessarily evolved to use these to fly, even if we have strapped ourselves to enormous contraptions. You know, our musculature isn't the best contrived for that. But nevertheless, people have persisted in the interest and in the attempts, enough so that for many years, there was an X Prize type activity, an incentive prize out there called the Kramer Prize, for the first group in the world capable of actually achieving a meaningful amount of human-powered flight. And it wasn't just a hang glider, and it wasn't just, you know, get a little bit of, cover a little bit of ground as you're jumping off a tall building. It was actually be able to control yourself, to fly in a figure 8, or to fly across a really long distance. And the founder of our company, Paul McCready, put together a small team that ended up winning this prize with a vehicle called the Gossamer Condor in the 1970s. It's essentially a vehicle made out of polystyrene and wood and plastic, in which you put a very lightweight, fit cyclist, someone not that different from a jockey, right, who has good endurance and good leg strength but doesn't weigh very much, who can generate enough force, generate enough thrust to have a vehicle like the Gossamer Condor that can fly across a couple kilometer long figure 8 loop, demonstrating not only can they fly, they can turn without clipping the ground or getting caught up in weird ground effects that make the vehicle uncontrollable. It was a prize that had stood for 18 years before it was claimed by Paul McCready and the young AeroVironment team. But obviously, as I said, it was an idea that had existed for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years beforehand. There was a sequel to the prize. The first one, again, called for that figure 8 loop. The second one called for a flight across the English Channel, which I don't know that I would have been brave enough to be the pilot, but they were able to find a few volunteers willing. Again, a vehicle, you see the height it is above the ground. You see how long it is. I suspect any one of you could probably lift that vehicle up in one arm, except for the pilot itself. It's a pretty lightweight ride with a really long wingspan that allowed us to achieve that thing. The way you do this is, again, about doing more with less, right? What Paul McCready was interested in, the reason he came to this prize was partly because he was a glider pilot and it was fun for him to think about this. But he believed that seeking incredible amounts of efficiency was key to the survival of humanity, right? The reason our company is called AeroVironment, it's a combination of aerospace and environment. He thought to avoid environmental crises and to be able to afford to do the wonderful things humanity wants to do, we really have to drive efficiency into every possible system, whether that's pulling out weight, pulling out complexity, pulling out time to build, doing all of the above. There were a few other Kramer prizes there. There was one for airspeed, where you could charge a battery, have a human charge a battery to give you a little bit of extra oomph in your propeller. The main reason I want to show this is just because it was an AIAA paper that I found about the bionic bat, which was the name of that particular vehicle. They also started experimenting in the later 70s with trying to put solar panels on top of these vehicles, and that achieved the first solar-powered flight with a human on board that I am aware of. Again, kind of doing it to win these prizes, mainly doing it as an engineering exercise to sort of test these concepts about how do you get hyper efficiency, how do you get really, really lightweight. And then the company took some strange turns, right? After setting all these records in the air, went and started to set some records on the ground. So partnered with General Motors to win the first ever solar car challenge, a global solar challenge to race across Australia. Again, how do you make solar panels? This is in the late 70s, early 80s. Solar panels are not as efficient as they are these days. How do you still make a vehicle that is low mass enough and streamlined enough and efficient enough to be able to not only have the power to race Australia, to do it, I think, a couple days ahead of the second place competitor, which is both a reliability problem as well as an efficiency problem. And when those two fields started to combine, really, how do you make solar panels into aerodynamic vehicles and make them very efficient? How do you do really, really lightweight flying structures? It allowed our team to partner with NASA on a set of vehicles, starting with the Pathfinder that I'm showing you here, which evolved into the Pathfinder Plus, and later into a couple vehicles called Centurion and then Helios. These are what are called HAPS, and I know we have some great sessions about HAPS here at SciTech. HAPS is high altitude persistent stratospheric flight, or high altitude platform station keeping, or people have a few different ways of spelling out the acronym. Essentially, these are solar powered stratospheric aircraft, giant flying wings where the upper skin is all solar panel. And these are aircraft that can get up quite high in the atmosphere and can fly effectively indefinitely, right? So the Helios vehicle that you're seeing here holds the altitude record for sustained flight here on Earth, flying in at just under 100,000 feet. And it's enough, you charge the batteries enough from those solar panels during the day to continue flying through the night. You descend a little bit through the night and then you climb back up. And again, you can effectively fly indefinitely. These don't have humans on board. These are remotely piloted systems, but allowed a great observation platform from NASA. They have defense capabilities, they have telecommunications capabilities, and allowed us to set another record and fly in a regime where humanity didn't have a whole lot of experience of what is it like to fly in those kind of Reynolds numbers. What is it like to be in the atmosphere up at those levels? This work happened, and it has since been rejuvenated for defense and commercial applications in addition to its civil applications. But nicely, this idea caught these achievements caught the eyes of some great folks at the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory, including this guy, Bob Ballaram, author of many an AIAA paper that I encourage you to read. Bob has recently retired from JPL, but he is what I would consider the father of the idea of the modern Mars helicopter. People have thought of flying on Mars for a long time. You can go back to science fiction, whether it's airships or other kinds of flying vehicles. The idea of getting around Mars had been around for a while, but Bob was one of the ones who was the champion of actually going and getting in the lab, getting in the test chamber, building real things, spinning them up, trying to figure out if this would indeed be possible. Bob's a wonderful engineer and wonderful human being. He's also mainly a space guy, and so he was looking to partner with an aviation company, specifically one that had experience flying in really thin atmospheres. Because the atmosphere at ground level on Mars is about 1% the density of the atmosphere at ground level here on Earth. which is pretty darn similar to the atmosphere at about 100,000 feet here on Earth. So he was looking for folks who had flown in those regimes. That list was pretty small. It was basically AeroVironment. And by lucky coincidence, we were one city away in Southern California. So made for a nice natural fit for us to partner with Bob and his team and to start working on an idea of a Mars helicopter. Now, this is way before my time, but from talking to some of the leaders at the company back then, I don't think anyone actually ever thought that this would fly. This was a fun, kind of academic exercise. It was great to build some stuff, to get into the test chamber. The engineers all loved working on it. And we knew that we were going to learn something, right? As you have all experienced in your careers, whenever you really constrain a problem, you have to get so creative to solve that very constrained problem. You're going to test yourself, you're going to push yourself, you're going to discover something new. And that's exactly what we started to do. The reason why Bob was interested in Mars helicopters was not just it was fun for engineers to nerd out about, although that certainly was important. It was also because Mars helicopters can fill a really valuable function as we explore other worlds. I like to think about it like this. It's kind of similar in some ways to the argument about human spaceflight versus robotic spaceflight. We have different vehicles already that explore Mars in different ways, and they are fundamentally just good at different things. So you've got your orbiters and your flybys. Humanity has done more of those than any other type of Mars vehicle. They are great because they generally tend to get you full planet coverage, or at least most planet coverage, depending what orbit you're in. They're also really far away from the surface, right? And you're basically looking straight down, or slightly off nadir, but basically you're looking straight down on everything you see, which is good for doing regional surveys, for mapping things. It's hard for finding specific things and making really specific discoveries. Again, I started my career as a planetary scientist, and the amount of hours that I would spend poring over images to try and figure out the origin story of a particular feature on Mars, you are operating with so little data. Even when you have multiple instruments doing multiple passes over the same area, if a pixel is 1 kilometer or less, as it often is on these instruments, there's only so many questions that you can answer with that. Then you get to landers, which get you a ton of information about the things that a lander can reach, or maybe that a stationary lander can see. So our sort of the other end of the spectrum, the highest resolution, highest fidelity data about the lowest possible geographical area. Rovers are somewhere in between on that spectrum. They can move around a lot more than a rover, right? Now than a lander. We now have several NASA rovers on Mars that have effectively run a marathon or a marathon and a half. So they're covering tens of kilometers of ground, carrying, at most sort of 10 instruments. So again, they're able to get up close. They can see down at the almost microscopic level, depending what instruments they're carrying. And they can explore a neighborhood. Not a house, not a stage. They could just, explore this hotel. And that is helpful. But imagine a first-time visitor to Earth who only came to International Drive in Orlando. They're not going to understand the full geological history of our planet, right? They won't know what the poles are like. They won't know what the oceans are like. They won't know what the forests are like, etc. Obviously, we don't have all those things on Mars, but you kind of get the point. Helicopters, again, are operating in a sort of an in-between regime here. They are more mobile than than rovers. They can go much further in a day. They fly much faster. And they can cross terrain that rovers will never cross, right? You have probably all seen the pictures of the wheels of the Mars rovers, right? Go look it up if you haven't. Check out the wheels of the Curiosity or the Perseverance rover. They are all beaten up and cut up from trying, and that is deliberately using them to try and cross across the easiest, safest ground to cross. They still cannot go over very jagged rocks, over very steep terrain. We've lost some rovers end their mission because they've gotten effectively stuck in a sand trap, right? And that says nothing of crossing a crevasse or climbing a cliff, right? And if you think about, for any of you who are interested in geology, things like cliff faces are often the best place for geologists to explore because you get to see all the different layers of rock. And that's like going back in time for a geologist. It's showing you the entire history of a region. A helicopter has no problem climbing a cliff. That's sort of what it does every single time it takes off. It has no problem flying through a ravine or into a crevasse or even into something like a skylight in a lava tube. So if you have a hollow lava tube, one of the most fascinating places to study on Mars, particularly if you ever hope to send humans there. Sometimes the roof will collapse and you'll have an entryway into a lava tube. You could imagine sending a very complicated bipedal robot or some kind of a complex rover that could climb over the rubble and rappel down the side of this or you could kind of find a helicopter into it. And again, it's not all that much different from any other flight the helicopter has done, at least not until you get pretty far into the lava tube. And nicely, helicopters are inexpensive, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. So we've been studying this idea of Mars helicopters for quite some time. Again, not necessarily thinking it was ever going to fly, but sure as heck having a lot of fun thinking about it. Really pushing our talented engineers to come up with how do you make this system as low mass as possible. There is so little atmosphere on Mars. Again, 1% of the thickness of what we're used to here. For any of you who are helicopter pilots yourself, first of all, my hat's off to you, you crazy people. Also, you know, helicopter flight on Earth is kind of a challenge, right? Doing it on Mount Everest doesn't happen that often. Doing it at 100,000 feet is insane. So we were looking at doing it at effectively 100,000 feet altitude type density, you know, a pretty long way away from Earth, where you couldn't service the vehicle, where you couldn't do routine inspections of seals, all those other kinds of things. It was a fun idea. But lo and behold, many years into thinking about this, sort of as a casual academic exercise, we very quickly got an opportunity to actually fly it. The previous NASA administrator, Jim Bridenstine, kind of got interested in the idea, which was really championed by Charles Alachi, the then outgoing head of the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory. The NASA Perseverance rover, also called Mars 2020, was gearing up for launch in 2020 and had a little bit of mass left over on the vehicle to carry to Mars. And they finally made a decision in May of 2018 to go ahead and fly a helicopter, not as a science instrument, but as a technology demonstrator, just to show, is flight possible on Mars? It was a little bit of a sprint to go from, hey, actually we can build a real vehicle and fly it, wow, isn't that cool, to holy cow, we got to be on the launch pad really darn soon. So in the course of just over a year, the teams at AeroVironment and JPL collaborated very, very closely to build this wonderful vehicle called Ingenuity that launched in July of 2020, landed as part of the rover in February of 2021. Let's see if this will play for us. So this, again, was an interesting packaging challenge. Helicopters are low mass, but they're not necessarily low volume, right? You need a long rotor blade to be able to grab enough air to catch up and fly. And we didn't have an accommodation already designed for us. We were being built into a rover that was already in final assembly in the clean room. And by the way, was built to print copy of another rover that had already been on Mars for many years. So we had to find a way to squeeze this helicopter into the belly of the rover. By coincidence, my wife worked as a flight director at NASA JPL at the time, and I can tell you those were some fun conversations. Again, really driving yourself to think efficiently where millimeters matter and where milligrams matter on both of these vehicles. But found a way to incorporate the vehicle into the belly of the rover. Once the rover was safely on Mars and had explored around for a month or two, deposited the rover onto the surface of Mars, drove away and took some photos of it, grabbed some nice selfies of the helicopter with the rover. And now we had our first airfield on Mars and our first aircraft with its landing gear down, ready to go and see if we could spin up the blades, nice way to check that you're actually working, and then eventually, not too long after, start to take flight. And this is supposed to be a video. It's a little hard to tell because actually the vehicle is flying pretty steadily, but I don't think that's playing. Let me try again here. There you go. So we were able in 2021 to have Ingenuity, the first ever aircraft on another world, take to the skies. The pretty simple first flight, pretty simple first 5 flights. Again, this was not a science mission. This was an opportunity to show that flight on Mars was possible. And check. Flight on Mars is indeed possible. If you think really, really hard, really, really keenly about efficiency, we were able to take this vehicle and make it fly through the air pretty stably. It was a fun day. These were still the early days of COVID when the world was horrible and terrifying and everybody was really looking for something to get excited about. So Ingenuity, I think, really caught the attention not only of us space geeks, as we have here at an AIAA conference, but I think of just about everyone on the planet who heard about Ingenuity, got fired up. That we'd had a Wright brothers moment, but on a different planet. And in fact, a little scrap of the fabric from the Wright brothers' 1903 flyer was carried to Mars and has now flown on Mars as part of this vehicle. So it was designed as a tech demo, as I mentioned. The goal was to do 5 flights. I remember asking my wife, who was the flight director for the rover at the time, okay, cameras are off, you're not in public, tell me honestly, how many times do you think it will fly? She said, oh, obviously 0. That was mostly the consensus opinion, I think, outside of these small teams at JPL and AeroVironment and others that had worked on this. They knew how hard it would be to fly on Mars. They also knew how quickly the vehicle had been built and how, relatively speaking, how little V&V had been done on the system compared to a typical JPL mission. Folks thought it would never take off, or if it took off, it certainly wasn't going to land in one piece. But it knocked out 5 flights just fine. You know, a couple of little hiccups getting started up on the very first flights. After that, flew like a star, really like a rock star. Was able to move into an extended mission, and we were able to take it from that plan of 5 first flights, which again, were not meant to explore ground regions. They were meant to go up and down, move side to side, show that the helicopter could take off, the helicopter could land, could do so safely. We could get the data back. We could assess the health of the vehicle. Now we started to go into an extended campaign and going farther afield and really starting to show what a helicopter is good for on Mars. And what we discovered is that a helicopter makes an excellent buddy for a rover because it goes faster and it can go to places the rover can't go. My wife's job as a flight director on Perseverance every day was essentially to adjudicate a fight in between the science team and the engineering team about whether the rover should turn left or turn right. The scientists always want to go to the most interesting, newest place, which is almost by definition the most hazardous place. That's why it's new and we haven't gone there before. The engineers really don't want to be the engineer on console when you break a wheel and strand a rover, so they're a little bit less risk tolerant of that. And someone has to sit down and say, okay, is it worth it to go to the more interesting place, knowing that we might never leave and never get to go to another place? Well, nowadays, if you have that dilemma, you'd fly the helicopter to the left. You figure out if it's as interesting as the science team hoped it might be. And if it is, you now have downward-facing, close proximity photographs of the entire route. And you can figure out how to get there faster, how to get there safer, and if you even want to go there at all. So in the end, you had Ingenuity, first aircraft to fly in another world. It was delivered on schedule and on budget. I'm in my mid-40s. It's the first time I've been able to say either of those things about any aerospace mission. It's really fun to be able to say them both, right? And NASA has said Ingenuity was about an $85 million mission all in. And if you're familiar with the cost of other Mars missions, that is about as much as a sneeze. That is really cost-effective. It was supposed to fly 5 times. It ended up flying 72. It was supposed to last 1 month. It ended up lasting about 3 years, including surviving a Martian winter, using largely commercial off-the-shelf parts, apart from specialty components like the rotor system that my wonderful team at AeroVironment built. Just to give you a few stats, and these are all easily accessible online, but to give you a sense of the vehicle, you see some of the baseball card stats, as I call them here. It's a pretty low-mass vehicle. As I've said, there is hardly any atmosphere on Mars. If you weigh too much, you will not get off the ground unless you have a giant rotor system that you are not going to fit into an already built rover. So it weighs 1.8 kilograms, weighs a couple of pounds. It is a tiny system mass-wise, and still relatively tiny volume-wise. It's all solar-powered. It was essentially entirely independent in its operations, other than it had a communications leech. It could not talk directly to Earth. It had to talk to the rover to talk to Earth. You see, again, some of the flights there. I've already showed the video, but racked up over 2 hours of flight time. We're able to fly, pretty far per flight. I know I'm mixing imperial and metric units here, which is always a no-no, but at least I'm declaring it. Flew across a pretty good distance, again, on a vehicle that would fly when it was convenient. So it really gives me great hope about what it could do. It played these wonderful roles of being the advanced scout, like I told you, and going to places that the rover knew it could never go. And we have taught our scientists more about Mars than we ever could have from that system. In fact, we have some great quotes from the science team saying, we never would have seen these things. We got our best view of these important areas on Mars. The whole reason we went to the Jezero crater with Perseverance is because it looks like an alluvial fan at the end of a river. We got our best view of some of the rocks in the most important places from a bird's eye view rather from a rover eyes view. We were able to go and collect samples, right? One of the main jobs of the Perseverance rover, the #1 priority for NASA's Science Mission Director going forward is returning samples from Mars. Some of those samples we would not have known to collect if we weren't able to send the helicopter as an advanced scout. The vehicle ended its mission in February of last year on Flight 72. We have just come out with the preliminary accident report, the first aircraft accident report on another world, which was kind of fun to be a part of, especially when you were so far in the bonus zone, right? We were actually not very upset that the aircraft crashed. It was a technology demonstrator. That is the way it is supposed to end its mission. You push it and you push it and you push it until it tells you, sorry, boss, I couldn't do that one. That happened on Flight 72. It's a longer report, but effectively what happened was the very primitive visual navigation system got a little bit lost when we had deliberately flown the aircraft into an area with sort of a bland area. When you looked at it from above, there were hardly any visual features to track. The vehicle got lost, came down pretty hard, moving down quickly and sideways pretty quickly. There's a couple hypotheses about what happened next, but essentially that's what happened. We're now thinking about what comes next. How do we take these great ideas, whether we've done them in the stratosphere here on Earth or on Mars, and go further? We've been engaged with JPL about how do you add more capability to these vehicles. We designed a system that adds an arm, a system that adds wheels. While staying in the Ingenuity class, you can pretty easily add about a kilogram worth of payload, supply maybe 30 watts of payload power in flight and more on the ground to a future system that might look a little something like this. This is a system in a test bed at JPL. So I just challenge you to think about what could you do with an aerial explorer on Mars? What are the missions that you could not accomplish any other way? What are the ways that you can assist your rover or your lander? If you are thinking about human crewed missions, I know if I were an astronaut exploring Mars, I certainly would want the ability to launch a drone, to explore the path in front of me, to drop Wi-Fi routers, comms repeaters, positioning beacons, to say, help, I've fallen and I can't get up, and call attention to an astronaut in need of assistance, to go and inspect my vehicle before I get back in it to come home, or before a windstorm approaches. I want to make sure I'm not a Mark Watney kind of situation. All these things are pretty possible with helicopters that can be built very fast, can be built very cheaply, very, very quickly, because of the heavy, heavy focus on efficiency. Okay, I think I'm out of time. Happy to answer questions if I have any time for it. I've also got my contact information. That should take you to my LinkedIn page. Would love to catch up with all of you after the talk as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Will. That was fascinating. If we could ask you to step over to the side, perhaps if there are audience participants that would like to ask questions, you could take.
Fantastic. I'll be right over there. I look forward to talking with you all. Thank you.